There is a particular kind of institution that produces a particular kind of man. Not a bad man, not a dishonest man. A man who has been through something genuinely difficult and has emerged from it with a specific and understandable conviction about the hierarchy of hard things in the world. The military produces this man in reliable quantities across every generation because the military is genuinely hard and the men who complete its most demanding programs have genuinely done something that most human beings on Earth could not do and have earned the right to know that about themselves. The problem is not the hardship. The problem is the conclusion that certain men draw from the hardship, which is that because the thing they survived was the hardest thing they can personally imagine, it is therefore the hardest thing that exists, and that the skills it developed in them are therefore the most complete skills available, and that any man who has not been through the same fire is operating with a deficit so fundamental that his presence in a serious room is a kind of presumption. Navy SEALs are not immune to this conclusion. Most of them are. The training selects for a quality of mind that tends to remain honest about its own limitations, even after the body has been pushed past limits that most people never approach. But occasionally, in the specific conditions produced by a combination of genuine toughness and a professional culture that reinforces the mythology of its own supremacy, the conclusion takes hold in a man who is otherwise capable and serious and worth knowing, and once it takes hold it tends to express itself in rooms where it does not belong with a confidence that the room was not expecting and is not required to accommodate. Snorts, on a Wednesday evening in the spring of 1993 at a private training facility in Coronado, California, a Navy SEAL named Davis made the conclusion audible in a room that contained Chuck Norris. What happened in the 90 seconds that followed has been described by the 6 people who witnessed it in terms that all point at the same essential observation, which is that the conclusion was answered with a completeness and an economy that left no room for supplementary argument, and that the man who delivered the answer did so without raising his voice or changing his expression or doing anything at all that suggested the answer had required any particular effort to produce. The facility in Coronado was operated by a former Marine named Gerald Ashworth who had retired from service in 1987 after 22 years and had used the discipline and the connections accumulated across those years to build a training space that served a specific clientele, which was serious practitioners from military and law enforcement and the combat sports world who wanted a place to work that was equipped for genuine training and populated by people who understood what genuine training required. Ashworth ran it with the straightforward authority of a man who had spent 2 decades being responsible for other men in difficult conditions and had developed through that experience a precise and unsentimental understanding of what a room full of capable people needed in order to function well, which was a clear set of expectations applied consistently and without favoritism regardless of rank or reputation or the particular mythology that any individual brought through the door. Clear's throat. The facility had a weight room, a padded mat area large enough for 6 people to grapple simultaneously, a heavy bag section along the south wall, and a small office at the back where Ashworth kept the administrative side of the operation, and where he occasionally sat in the evenings drinking coffee and reading after the last session had finished and the last practitioner had gone home. Chuck had been coming to Ashworth's facility for 8 months. He had been introduced through a mutual contact, a retired Army Ranger who had trained with Chuck in Los Angeles in the late 80s and had moved to the San Diego area and maintained the connection. Chuck came twice a week when his schedule permitted, on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, and he trained with the same quiet consistency he had brought to every training environment he had inhabited across 30 years of serious practice. He arrived without announcement. He worked without performance. He interacted with the other regulars in the direct, unhurried way of a man who has nothing to establish and therefore nothing to perform. The regulars had absorbed his presence with the practical equanimity of serious practitioners who understand that a man's reputation does not change what is required of them on the mat, and that the appropriate response to sharing a training space with someone accomplished is to pay attention and learn whatever the opportunity makes available. Snorts grated. Davis had been coming to Ashworth's facility for 3 weeks. He was 29 years old. 6'2" and 210 pounds, distributed across a frame that the SEAL training pipeline had spent 3 years developing into something genuinely impressive by any available standard. He had completed Bud.S the previous year and had been assigned to a team based out of the Coronado Naval Complex, and he carried the specific energy that men carry in the first year after completing something that required everything they had, which is the energy of a man who has recently discovered the outer boundary of what he thought he could endure and has pushed past it and emerged on the other side knowing that he did. This is a legitimate and earned quality, and it produces in most men who possess it a kind of grounded confidence that makes them good to train with and honest about their own development. In Davis it had combined with something else, something harder to name precisely, a specific impatience with the world outside the military framework, a tendency to sort every room he entered into two categories, the category of people who had been through what he had been through, and the category of people who had not, and to regard the second category with a skepticism that occasionally shaded into something less generous than skepticism. Snorts, he had heard Chuck's name when he arrived at Ashworth's facility on his first evening 3 weeks earlier. He had registered it with the expression of a man filing information under a category he has already decided on. Film star. Karate guy. Tournament fighter from 20 years ago. The categories were not entirely wrong as far as they went. They did not go very far. The Wednesday evening in question had begun as Wednesday evenings at Ashworth's facility typically began, with the gradual arrival of the regulars across a 30-minute window and the informal organization of the session that experienced practitioners manage without requiring anyone to direct it. There were 6 people present that evening. Chuck Ashworth himself, who occasionally trained alongside his clients when the evening was quiet enough to permit it. A retired DEA agent named Cordero who had been training at the facility for 2 years and whose judo was the best in the room on any given night. A sheriff's deputy named Tran who had grown up training Muay Thai in his family's gym in Orange County, and who moved with the relaxed technical fluency of a man who has been hitting things correctly since childhood. And Davis, who arrived last at 7:20, in the specific way that men arrive late to rooms when they have decided in advance that the room does not have anything to teach them, clears throat. The first 40 minutes were unremarkable, different people working different things in different sections of the space. Cordero and Tran on the mat, moving through a slow technical grappling session that was more conversation than competition. Chuck on the heavy bags, methodical and unhurried, the same short combinations he always worked, maintaining something rather than building it. The practice of a man who understands that consistency across time is the variable that compounds into something no single session can produce. Ashworth moving between sections, occasionally offering a technical observation, mostly watching with the attentive neutrality of a man responsible for the quality of the environment rather than the outcome of any individual exchange. Davis working alone in the weight room adjacent to the main floor, visible through the open doorway, moving through a circuit with the focused intensity of a man who is performing for himself rather than for any audience, which is a legitimate and serious way to train, and which the other people in the facility registered without comment. Snorts. Then Davis came through the doorway into the main floor. He had a towel around his neck and a water bottle in his right hand, and the specific expression of a man who has been alone with his own thoughts for 40 minutes and has arrived at something he intends to say out loud. He walked to the water cooler near the south wall. He filled his bottle. He looked across the room at Chuck on the heavy bags, working through the same methodical combinations he had been working through for the previous half hour. Davis watched him for a moment. Then he said something to Cordero, who was nearest to him, in the tone of a man who is not particularly concerned about whether the person he is talking about can hear him. He said that he had expected more from a man with Chuck Norris's reputation. He said that what he was watching looked like exercise rather than fighting. He said that the kind of training that produced tournament champions was a specific and narrow kind of training, and that specific and narrow training produced specific and narrow capability, and that specific and narrow capability was not the same thing as the kind of comprehensive readiness that genuinely dangerous situations required. Clear's throat. Cordero did not respond. He looked at Davis with the flat, patient expression of a man who has been around serious practitioners long enough to know that what has just been said is the kind of thing that tends to produce a response from the universe, whether or not anyone in the room chooses to respond to it directly. Davis walked closer to the bag area. Chuck had continued working through the exchange without any visible change in pace or attention. Davis stopped 8 feet away. He said that he had spent 3 years in a training pipeline that broke most of the men who entered it, and that the training had been designed to produce capability under conditions that no martial arts tournament had ever replicated, and that in his considered assessment the gap between tournament martial arts and genuine combat readiness was a gap that most martial artists were not equipped to honestly evaluate because they had never been on the correct side of it to make the comparison. He said this in the direct, declarative tone of a man stating established facts rather than offering a debatable opinion. He said it in front of 5 people. Then he said the thing. Snorts. He said that Chuck Norris's karate was fake. He said that the tournament circuit Chuck had built his name on was a controlled environment so removed from genuine violence that the skills it developed were essentially theatrical. He said that a man who had spent his career inside that environment did not belong in a serious training facility among people who had been genuinely tested. He said this looking at Chuck with the bright, flat confidence of a man who has convinced himself that the statement is an act of honesty rather than an act of aggression. He said it in a room that contained Gerald Ashworth, who had spent 22 years in the Marine Corps, and Cordero, who had spent 16 years in federal law enforcement, and Tran, who had grown up in a gym that produced professional fighters, all of whom had the specific stillness of people who have just heard something said that they know is going to require a response from the universe, regardless of anyone's preference in the matter. Chuck stopped working the bag. He stopped in the middle of a combination, not at the end of it, which is the kind of detail that people who do not understand physical training miss, and people who do understand physical training notice and remember. He turned around. He looked at Davis with the open, settled expression that the people who had trained alongside him across 30 years would have recognized immediately, which was the expression of a man who had heard this kind of thing before, in various rooms, from various men, and had developed through the repetition of hearing it a genuine equanimity about what hearing it required. He did not look angry. He did not look offended. He did not produce any of the visible emotional responses that the statement had perhaps been designed to produce. He looked at Davis the way he looked at everything in a training environment, which was with complete attention and without any of the noise that emotion adds to attention, when a man has not learned to keep the two things separate. He said that he appreciated the perspective. He said it without irony and without the particular flatness that men use when they want appreciation to sound like its opposite. Then he said that if Davis was interested in testing the perspective, the mat was available. He gestured toward the padded area in the center of the room. He said it the way he said most things, which was simply and without architecture. Snorts, greater thans. Davis looked at the mat. He looked at Chuck. He was 29 years old and 210 pounds, and had completed one of the most demanding military training programs on Earth, and was standing in a room where he had just said something that now required him to either honor it or retract it in front of 5 witnesses, and the path that preserved what he had said required him to walk to the center of the mat. He walked to the center of the mat. Chuck followed. He did not wrap his hands. He did not change his shoes. He stood in the same dark training clothes he had been wearing on the bags, with his hands loose at his sides and his weight even on both feet, and his eyes on Davis with the open, patient focus of a man who has been in this exact situation more times than he can easily count, and has learned that the most important thing at the beginning of any genuine exchange is to see what is actually in front of him rather than what he has decided is going to be in front of him. Ashworth moved to the edge of the mat area. Cordero and Tran stopped their session. The room organized itself around the cleared space in the quiet, automatic way that rooms full of serious practitioners organize themselves when something is about to happen that deserves full attention. Clear's throat, Ashworth said, "Go." Davis came forward with the controlled aggression of a man who has been trained to close distance and establish physical dominance in the fastest available time. He was fast, faster than the tournament circuit framing he had been using suggested he had given credit for, which is one of the things that serious military training genuinely does produce, which is the ability to move at speed towards something difficult without the hesitation that most people discover between their intention and their action. He threw a right cross that covered the distance between them with genuine commitment and genuine speed. Chuck rolled his left shoulder 4 inches inside the punch, and the cross went past his ear, and Davis's weight was committed forward, and Chuck planted his lead foot and threw a right sidekick to Davis's midsection, not calibrated in the way that the measured strikes in a teaching exchange are calibrated, thrown at the power of a man who has decided that the situation warrants a real answer rather than an instructional one. The kick landed flush, and the sound it made was the sound of a kick landing on a body that was moving toward it with its own forward momentum behind it, which multiplied the effective impact in the way that physics multiplies impact when 2 objects are moving toward each other rather than when only one of them is moving. Snorts. Davis absorbed it. He took a step back. He reset. The information arriving in his nervous system was the information that real contact always carries, which is the information that the man across from you is operating at a level that your prior estimate did not account for. He came forward again. He shot for a takedown, dropping his level and driving forward with his hips behind the motion. The technique that wrestling and military combatives develop in practitioners who have been taught that taking the fight to the ground is the fastest available path to a decisive outcome against a striker. It was a genuine takedown attempt, not a half-hearted one, executed with the committed forward drive of a man who has drilled it under pressure and understands its mechanics. Chuck sprawled. He dropped his hips back and down and spread his base and redirected Davis's driving head to the outside with his right hand and stepped to the side, and as Davis's momentum carried him past and downward, Chuck brought his right knee up into the space that Davis's forward driving face was moving through. He pulled the knee. He pulled it with the same precision that he pulled everything, which was complete and specific, and without any of the ambiguity that the word pulled sometimes implies. The knee stopped 3 inches from Davis's face, while Davis was still in motion, still driving forward, still committed to the takedown that had already stopped being available. It held there for the half-second required. Then Chuck stepped back and stood with his hands at his sides. Snorts. 31 seconds. Ashworth counted it because Ashworth counted everything in his facility, not with a formal timer but with the internal clock of a man who had been responsible for other men's training. For long enough that duration had become instinctive. 31 seconds from the first movement to the knee that stopped 3 inches from the face and held there in the air while the room processed what it was looking at. Davis was on one knee on the mat. His right hand was on the padded surface for balance. He was breathing. He had not been hurt in any way that would require attention. But he was on one knee on the mat in a room with 5 witnesses, and a knee had stopped 3 inches from his face, from an angle he had not tracked, and at a speed he had not anticipated, and the 31 seconds had contained 2 complete answers to the statement he had made 8 feet from the heavy bags 11 minutes earlier. Chuck walked to him. He extended his hand downward in the same unhurried way he extended his hand in every context, where a hand was the appropriate thing to extend. Davis looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man doing a rapid and uncomfortable internal accounting. Then he took it. Chuck pulled him to his feet without any visible effort. They stood facing each other on the mat, and the 4 people at the edge of the mat waited with the specific patience of people who understand that what happens in the next few seconds is the most important part of what they are going to witness that evening. Clear's throat. Chuck said something. He said it quietly enough that Cordero, who was closest, caught the shape of it but not every word, and described it afterward as the kind of thing that a serious man says to another serious man, when the serious man has just demonstrated something and wants the demonstration to be useful rather than merely decisive. He said that Davis moved well. He said that the commitment was genuine and that genuine commitment was the thing that could not be taught and was therefore the thing that mattered most. He said that the gap was not in the physical capacity, but in the reading, in the ability to see what was in front of him rather than what he had decided was going to be in front of him, and that the reading was a thing that developed over time on the mat and could not be developed any other way, the same way he applied it to everything else, which was completely and without exception. Ashworth spoke about it once, years later, to a journalist writing a profile of the facility who asked him about the most memorable thing he had witnessed in the training space over the course of his years running it. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. He said that the most memorable thing was not the 31 seconds, though the 31 seconds had been as complete a demonstration of distance management under genuine pressure as he had seen in 22 years of being around serious practitioners in military and civilian contexts. He said the most memorable thing was what happened after the 31 seconds, which was a 47-year-old man in dark training clothes walking back to the heavy bag he had been working and resuming exactly where he had left off, in the middle of a combination, at the same methodical pace, with no visible acknowledgement that anything had occurred to interrupt the session. He said that the going back to the bag at the same pace was the thing that contained everything the 31 seconds contained, and then something additional that the 31 seconds alone could not contain, which was the specific quality of a man who does not require the room to confirm what he knows about himself, because the knowing was established a long time ago under conditions that did not require a room to make it official. Snorts. There are 2 kinds of seriousness that a man can develop across a life of demanding practice. The first kind is the seriousness that announces itself, that requires an audience to validate it. that measures itself against other men's reputations and finds in the comparison the confirmation it is looking for. The second kind is the seriousness that does not require announcement because it was built in conditions that had no use for announcement, on training floors and competition mats, and in genuine exchanges with genuine opponents across enough years that the building itself became the confirmation, and the confirmation became internal, and the internal confirmation made the external variety unnecessary. Davis had arrived at Ashworth's facility in Coronado in the spring of 1993 with the first kind of seriousness and had left the mat on a Wednesday evening 31 seconds. After Ashworth said go with the beginning of the second kind taking shape in the place where the first kind had been. The beginning of the second kind is not a comfortable thing to carry. It requires a man to revise his accounting of himself in ways that the first kind never required. But it is the only kind that the mat will eventually confirm, and the mat in the end is the only confirmation that the practice has ever offered or ever will offer to any man willing to step onto it and find out what is true.